What's up, comrade? How's it going? Trying to pull up our the advertisement for the event. Let's see. Share screen. Mm-mm-mm. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Is the audio okay? Eddie's coming on in 15 or so minutes. Um, we like to say that we are time zone challenged because we always seem to f up things according to time zone. So he thought that when I was telling him one time that I was referring to Central, but I was referring to Eastern. So, but he should be hopping on within the next 15 minutes or so. At 7 o'clock, we're going to start an event that's hybrid. Okay, an event that's hybrid. So if you're in the South Florida area and you want to hit it up, contact Troika Collective on Instagram, and they'll send you the address of where the event is going to be. Of course, knowing the nature of the political scene down here in South Florida, it's not an address that can just be put out there like that. So, if you're interested, please do contact Troika Collective on Instagram, and they'll tell you where it is. I looked at the spot; it seems like a really chill spot. So, um, I think these hybrid events of half people online and half in person are pretty cool. What's up, comrade? Um, I know that the the school that Gabriel Rockhill and some other folks run of critical theory, they've been doing theirs hybrid, and it seems to have been working nicely. But today we're going to be talking about abortion rights, the Cuban Revolution. We're going to talk about the blockade. What sorts of activities can we do to counter the blockade? The Troika Collective folks also had people who just came back from brigades to Cuba. So they're going to be talking about their experience in Cuba. And that's always good to see. One of the things that usually comes up when we try to defend the socialist country is people on the right saying, "Have you ever been to X?" Right? Or usually people from the diaspora that come from the wealthier classes, which were probably expropriated if there was a popular revolution going on, as such is the case with a lot of the folks in Miami, especially the people that came in the first generation after the revolution. One of the things that they tell you is, "Have you ever even gone to Cuba?" Right? Or "Why don't you go to Cuba?" So brigades are very important because it allows you to go to the country, so that you can reply when these people tell you, "Why don't you go to Cuba?" Tell them, I have, right? But it also helps you make great connections with people there. It helps you see concretely what the conditions are. So that's always nice. I know the Troika folks have someone who just came back, I think yesterday, from a brigade. So it's going to be cool to listen to their experience. And then another one of the speakers is a fellow by the name of Daniel from Belly of the Beast. Belly of the Beast is this, I believe, newer project. I've been following the series that they've done on Cuba and the effects of the blockade during the time of the pandemic, and it's been pretty superb. They're just very professional looking short documentaries, 15-minute each. I think they have like six of them or so. So we're going to have someone from that project talking today. I think he is one of the people that's going to be in person, but it should be good. And I wanted to get a quick conversation with Eddie beforehand. He mentioned to me that he was going to be also live streaming, reacting to the stream through TikTok. So that should be good. The more eyes, the merrier. What's up, comrade? We got a gorilla there and a sun, I believe, a black sun. Is there a reason we don't really like Trotsky, if you don't mind me asking? Um, there's a few. there's quite a few reasons. I think the most pertinent reason why we don't like Trotsky is uh, primarily because of Trotskyites and the factionalism of Trotskyites, and because there's a pipeline from Trotskyites to the far right. Oh, we have compañero Eddie. What's up, brother? I'm just
Hey, how's it going, buddy?
good. I'm tackling a question here about Trotsky real quick.
Oh,
Um,
nice, perfect.
is there a reason why we don't like Trotsky? Well, the primary reason is that a lot of them have this phenomenon that I've been calling the purity fetish, which rejects socialism because it doesn't reach their standards of what a proletarian state should look like. So that's one of the main like practical disagreements. I have, of course, some theoretical disagreements and historical ones, but there's a lot of Trotskyite groups and Trotskyite thinkers that I know that are a little bit better on some of those points, and I think that in those cases it's usually fruitful to work with them. I know that the guy from I forget what the name of the journal is. I think it's the Socialist Alternative. I might be wrong. It's one of the major Trotskyite journals. Alan Wood. I think it's either Wood or Woods. I get confused because there's a philosopher whose name is Alan Woods as well. But um, he's Alan Woods is really good in when it comes to theory, to Marxist theory. So one of the things that distinguishes us as Marxist Leninists is not just the political practice, how we engage with it, how we relate ourselves to actually existing socialism, but also certain sets of theoretical questions, like how we think about dialectics. Does it exist in nature? Right? That was a big debate. How we think about the relationship of Engels to Marx. Oh, I love the glasses. Nice.
Thank you.
So
These professional lights are bright, or semi-professional light.
semi-pro. Um, we used to joke around when I was in baseball about semi-pro a lot. Um, but there's certain like key theoretical questions that you can also see like Eastern and Western Marxism split over, and I, most of the Trotskyite theories that I've engaged with are usually on the side of the Marxist-Leninists with regards to some of these key questions. So I read them, I enjoy some of their work, but politically, I think that's where the biggest disagreements are. But I think that a lot of them, or I've seen some organizations that are better than others when it comes to supporting actually existing socialism.
There's
There is
so
that
many
pipeline, though.
Trotskyists in America too. You're almost pretty much forced to work with them at some point in some capacity, just because of how widespread it is. Because as Gabriel Rockhill said, like Trotskyists are allowed to a place in academia or are given a spot because they denounce existing socialism. So they've been there are a lot of really prominent Trotskyist thinkers in the West, sort of as a result of that. And like I don't know, I think a good example of like what's good and bad about Trotskyists is Ernest Mandel's Introduction to Capital Volume 2, because he's a Trotskyite Marxist, and he goes through this like really really detailed, thorough dialectical analysis of the Soviet economy,
Hmm.
the economy in the Soviet Union, basically explaining how their economy worked, how the planners, or how the economic plans were created, how they industrialized stuff like that. And then his conclusion though, after like 60 pages of analysis, is like, and also they failed because they didn't abolish the commodity form. It's like, oh wow, what incredible analysis, Trotskyites. So it's like they give this really good and thorough economic analysis that's really, really useful for explaining what's going on. I learned a lot about how the Soviet economy worked from Ernest Mandel versus, say, he compared and contrasted it to like Yugoslavia's economy too. Um, but yeah, his political conclusion that like the Soviet Union should be denounced because they didn't abolish the commodity form. That's why they failed. Like, no, they understood, very well that they weren't going to abolish the commodity form right away.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Well, since I come from like an academic background, I'm used to reading a little bit of everything. And I think that's sometimes not the case in spaces of militancy. They tell you just read what's in politically in line with where you are, and I
Yeah.
think that's a mistake. I think Trotsky and Trotskyite theorists are worth reading, if anything, in order to compare to what the more mainstream Marxist Leninist or what they would call Stalinist currents of communism say. And honestly, I think that on 9/10 of things, there's more agreement than disagreement, and especially in the condition that we're in the U.S., there's definitely places where we can work together.
Yeah. Our friend Jiang Zhu the other day said, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He's the Bolshevik rapper, Bolshevik beat maker is his Twitter bio. Who everyone should follow. He's a Marxist Leninist who talks a lot about China. But he said, most Marxists in the U.S., if they had a debate with a Taiwanese liberal about, Taiwan and China, they would probably lose. Because most of us don't know the history of Taiwan or the mainland or Taiwan's connection to the mainland, even though we speak confidently about it. And, I was even thinking to myself, like, I talk a lot about China and I research China a lot, but I would probably lose a debate to a Taiwanese liberal because I don't understand the history well enough. It's like most Americans just think like the Kuomintang was plopped off there, after the Civil War, and now they're right wing, and the U.S. tries to use them to attack the mainland, but it's a lot deeper than that, and Taiwan has a history, or is considered part of China, and there's a deep connection between Taiwan and the mainland. So it's not as simple as, China just, kicking out all the right wingers and the U.S. imperialists. Reunification is complicated. So, yeah, always good to read what the other side has to say, um, even if you vehemently disagree with it, because that's the only way you can know how to combat it. And understand your own position better in relation to that.
Yeah, and especially with regards to U.S. issues, like we're born and bred.
Oh, Carlos just got a Wi-Fi extender today too. Apparently, he just got a
On
toaster.
the other side, and that's one of the oh boy.
You
Um,
glitched out.
yeah, let me. Do you mind staying on the stream so that I can relocate somewhere closer to the main router? Because I guess this extender
Definitely.
spot is
Yeah,
no
what
good.
happened to the extender? Did you accidentally get a toaster?
Yeah, I just have this massive toaster next to the laptop.
We'll
But the
plug
the
it into your
extender came
laptop.
it came with the cable, with the
Yeah.
Ethernet cable, and I was hyped about it. But then I realized my laptop doesn't have the plug-in for an Ethernet
No
cable.
way.
Yeah,
Your laptop doesn't?
no,
What
it
kind of
doesn't.
laptop doesn't have an Ethernet or internet or Ethernet plug-in? That's lame. That
Yeah,
stinks.
I don't know.
I'm
Let
excited
me
to
hop
get one of
out
those.
and let me hop out and relocate real quick so that the Wi-Fi is good. I don't want to be frozen
Yeah.
in the middle of the thing.
Yeah. I have um I'm gonna have an Ethernet cable soon. That's the best way to stream because then you're hardwired to your internet rather than reliant on Wi-Fi. Plus, the 5G is giving us all COVID, so I shouldn't say that. We're gonna get banned even for joking. It's a QAnon conspiracy. I'm kidding. It's not how people got COVID. Get an Ethernet to USB connector. Oh, they make those? I'll have to let Carlos know when he comes back. I feel kind of like a tool with these glasses on, but I swear to y'all, my lights are just too bright right now. I can't take it. It'll give me a headache. Oh, Ethernet to USB connector. What do you know? It's like $7. That's in our budget. Barely. Barely. And it gets something like social monarchy. Even though it seems contradictory, what does that mean? What do you mean social monarchy? We don't need a monarchy. We need democracy. like people call the DPRK a monarchy, but that's not correct. The Kim family are voted in. I mean, for one, but two, the Workers' Party of Korea is the party that's in power. And a large number of the working masses are a part of the Workers' Party of Korea, and the vast majority of the country supports the party if they're not part of it and active in it. And then their entire government is elected, and yeah, like they have propaganda, but one, they're isolated from the outside world by the U.S. sanctions, by the fact that they're not allowed in the IMF and World Bank. And then their propaganda is based on, let's construct socialism, maintain our independence and sovereignty, and defeat the imperialists who killed 20% of our population 70 years ago and have kept us under economic embargo and occupied half the peninsula ever since. And meanwhile, the U.S. propaganda, is North Korea's evil. They don't have nuclear weapons for self-defense. They're going to attack us. We need to sanction them and try to starve their people because their rulers are starving their people. Don't make no sense. One of my friends told me they're a social monarchist, so I thought I'd ask. I don't even know what that is. See, I know this because of TikTok. There's a lot of just like random political ideologies on the internet. People sort of play with them like it's a game. They just like shop for political ideologies. There's a YouTube account that parodies the sort of idea that people are just shopping for different goofy ideologies called JREG, JREG. But like social monarchy, like for one, nobody knows what that is. And we've had revolutions to replace monarchies. There's very few like monarchic systems left in the world, and if they are, they're like the ones in England where they're just for show, when really the oligarchy, the capitalist oligarchy and political state are the real rulers of the country, although the royalty is used as an imperialist apparatus as well, but it's mostly for show. So it's a reactionary idea to have a monarchy. And then like even if you thought it was a good idea to have a monarchy, how are you going to convince the masses to put a monarch in power? How are you going to come to power as a monarch? Or how is this system going to be implemented? There's no path to implementation here. I mean, that's the main thing with socialism, with scientific socialism, is it's realistic, because the masses of society make up the majority, and their labor is what all of society is grounded upon. The production and reproduction of human life is dependent on the labor of the masses, giving them incredible power always. Creating the potential for socialism, if you add the technology and the productive capacity that's been created by humans and by capitalism, but also by socialism. If you look at countries like China and the USSR or Russia, not to say Russia's socialist, but their wealth was built up during the USSR. They became a superpower in the era of the USSR. But like a monarchy, how are you gonna get to a monarchy? How are you gonna implement that system? Where the heck did Carlos go? Did his internet break? Hey, amazing Eddie. Hello. Thanks for calling me amazing. All Gulf monarchies are supported by the American empire for a reason. Yeah, there you go. That's a good point. So is a social monarchy something like the UAE or Qatar? So this is a good point. Speaking of the Gulf monarchies. Oh, there's Carlos. What's up? Speaking of the Gulf monarchies, that might be what a social monarchy is, because they have basically what's called a kafala system. So there are migrant workers who do most of the labor, related to oil or whatever else. So they're immigrants who are in these contracts, which basically makes them workers and tenants of this landlord upper middle class, petty bourgeois class, which is made up of natives of Qatar or the UAE, because they have all this oil wealth from the U.S. using them as puppet states, or U.S. oil oligarchs using them as puppets. So they have these social programs, so like social welfare programs that you can only get, that you only have access to if like your parents are from the UAE or from Qatar or whatever. And these people are also the landlord class, so they are the benefactors of this kafala system. They have tenants who pay them rent, and who work without the benefits of this, without payments from these social welfare programs from the government. And then they're locked in. They can't leave because that's how the kafala contracts work. So it's very, very, very close to slavery. And then you have, of course, so that creates like this petty bourgeois middle landlord class. And then above that, you have, of course, the oligarch class of like these monarchs, and then the oil oligarchs who work directly with the U.S. oil companies. And some of the richest people in the world are in like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. So it's extremely unequal if you look at like the laboring class is like the migrants. And then you have petty bourgeois. Carlos, where'd you go? We miss you.
I had to relocate. I'm surrounded by 3 Wi-Fi extenders now, so let's see if one didn't do the work, maybe 3 will.
Dang. Hopefully.
It sucks, man, because on my end it looks good, and then I'll look at the recording and it looks like I was, on a fucking flip phone or something.
Yeah.
It's a shame.
We have a suggestion from the audience. You can get a USB Ethernet cable.
Like
So
the Ethernet cable itself or an adapter?
it's an adapter. So you plug the USB into your laptop, and then there's a little box that you can plug the Ethernet cable into.
I'll write that down.
Amazing, Carlos, too. Thank you. We appreciate the kind words.
3rd time's the charm. There you go.
Yep. Good call.
I'm excited to talk about Cuba. I wonder, how much I can extend myself in terms of like the colonial history and shit. But I'm the type of person that, because of our Marxist analysis, like I think that it's always important to situate things in like longer, medium, and short context, right?
Mm-hmm.
How the long context influence the medium, and then like that. So whenever I talk about Cuba, I like to start the story in the 18th century. And my fear is that, we're going to do this event with people who just want to do something against the blockade, and I'm there talking about, the sugarcane industry in Cuba in the 18th century or something.
I think you'll be all right. Don't go in with confidence. Be humble but confident, and
Humble
you'll be
but
fine. So did you already explain to the stream exactly what it is that you're doing tonight?
Yeah, we're collaborating with this group called Troika Collective, and we're going to be doing an event to talk about abortion rights, I believe, the blockade on Cuba, the influence that the blockade has on the material conditions of Cubans. And it's an event that's going to be hybrid. So it's going to be done live, like in person, in a spot here in South Florida. If you guys want to go to that spot, you can hit up Troika Collective on Instagram, and they'll tell you where it is. Of course, they wouldn't put it on the ad, given the political climate of Miami. That would be too bright. Yeah, but when they do the drives and the events with Puente de Amor against the blockade, since it's more open and the address is given, there's usually a big group of Lusanos that show up. And I was watching the live stream from Troika of last month, and there was a group of people trying to get into fights from the Lusanos' side. So the event is secure. I've seen the location. It's a nice little bar, but it's also hybrid, so you can watch it. We're going to be streaming it through YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. And It's going to have someone from Troika that just came back from a brigade in Cuba. So they're going to tell us a little bit about the time they spent there. And then there's also a journalist. His name is Daniel. I don't know his last name, but he's from Belly of the Beast, which is this really nice program. I think they're out of Cuba directly, but they might be mixed. But they do these fantastic documentaries on the effect the blockade has on Cuba, and that's that.
Yeah, I'm pumped for that. Are we streaming that on Midwestern Marx, or
Yeah, yeah,
that's the plan, right?
yeah.
And what's the date and time on that?
What's 19 minutes
19 minutes
today?
from now. All right. And I'm gonna stream on TikTok and tell people to go watch Carlos, because we had our TikTok. Our I'm a little bit surprised or a little bit salty because our TikTok about Jeff Young went viral, which I thought it might, and then it kind of pushed people to our YouTube, but not as not as much as I thought. I'm like, people suck. It's so hard to transfer an audience.
Yeah, it's just I don't understand how things go viral on TikTok, but then it's like very difficult to get it to go viral on YouTube when they
Does
have a lot of the
anyone?
same functions.
Yeah, does anyone in the chat know? Like, is there anything that we're doing that's just blatantly stupid on YouTube or Twitch? Because I have going viral on TikTok down to a science. It's for one, it's quantity over quality. You just have to post a lot. But then short videos, snappy videos, snarky videos. People like that stuff, and they get big. But and our Twitch and YouTube has grown a ton too. We're super grateful for that. But we haven't had any like YouTube or Twitch videos go viral and like bring in a bunch of followers.
Mhm. I think the in YouTube the one that you did on Venezuela, like 2 years, it was like our 10th video. It's been the most successful one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great video. As soon as every time I go post something new, it always pops up, and it's an Eddie that looks like it's not just 2 years. Like the last 2 years have aged you because in that video you look like you're 15 or something.
I know.
Hello, everybody. I want to talk to you today about Venezuela. I'm doing this because it's a video.
Yeah, I watched that part of that the other day. Um, Seems like forever ago now. Kyle wants us to watch the Armchair Historians. What happened after the Eastern Bloc? Yeah, we'll definitely watch that at some point. I'm copy and pasting it into our videos to watch right now because that sounds interesting. Not today, because obviously Carlos is gonna be doing this event here soon, but at some point for sure.
I'm also
You're gonna
looking
have to come
forward.
back.
I'm also looking forward to us watching and reacting to the Living in China guy. We're able to check out his channel.
Oh, I have not yet.
It's
I'm
gonna.
excited.
I was addicted after I saw the first video. I ended up watching just 2 days worth of stuff. It's insane how much China has developed, and the guy's living at a 5-tier city.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even one of. It's not like Beijing or Shanghai that he's living in, and it's just it makes like the richest cities in the U.S. look underdeveloped.
That's crazy. That was an awesome tweet that you made. Because it's true. It's true because, of course, like, even in the richest cities in the U.S., like I was in, and some of them are looking really, really worn down and bad and, economically destitute. But even, the biggest, richest cities, there's homelessness everywhere. There's poverty everywhere. Isn't Skid Row in L.A. the, road that's notorious for homeless people and drug addicts living there? Like, in this place with all this wealth and opulence and some of the wealthiest people in the world, so even China, even though maybe, they're getting close, but maybe still they have less overall wealth because we have so many absurdly wealthy, luxurious oligarchs in this country. But like, as far as the stability in of their cities and what they look like, and there's no homeless people there and stuff. And The fact that people in the U.S. can still look at that, including socialists, and be like, nope, socialism hasn't worked because they have a security state or whatever. Like, oh my God, like, there's no homeless people. There's no homeless people. Look at any city in the U.S. where homeless people are littering the streets, which is terrible. But is Carlos frozen? Oh, I was like, man, he has been in that position for a while. I was like, I'm almost impressed that he hasn't moved. I was continuing my rant like way longer than I wanted to, because because I was waiting for Carlos to jump in, but he was frozen the whole time. I was talking to a cardboard cutout of Carlos. Cardboard cutout of Carlos. Oh, there's another armchair historian video called "Life in East Germany." I think we should react to that too. Gotcha. All right, it's on the list. It's on the list. Hopefully, Carlos can figure out his internet situation before he does that stream with the Troika Collective people. Our technological skills are so bad, but I will say, I will give Carlos crap about this. He is even worse than me. Like, he bought a Wi-Fi extender. I was like, you just need an Ethernet cable, but an Ethernet cable came with his Wi-Fi extender. We couldn't figure out how to plug it into his laptop. Thwarted again. But we're gonna get it figured out, and then our Wi-Fi will be better than even the greatest streamers. We'll have the greatest Wi-Fi. Our Wi-Fi will be spectacular, 1,000 times better than Hassan's. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. His videos hurt my brain. Whose? I forgot. Oh, the armchair historian. Is it like a liberal historian? Boo. Yeah, I don't know. History, the way history is distorted, like propagandized history is so frustrating because it's like propaganda in real time. I understand how it's hard for people to see it, right? Because like we are learning a lot about Ukraine and the U.S. media narratives and lies in Ukraine as time goes on. But it's hard to see them all in real time, right? Unless you're just super, super skeptical of everything the US media reports, which you should be, but not everybody is. Versus like, once time has passed and more information comes out, we can look back and make a more accurate assessment, or most people can. I think we should always try and see through the propaganda and argue against imperialism. But I understand why it's harder to do that and harder to see through the propaganda in real time versus, in hindsight. Like now we can look back at Iraq and we know that there were no WMDs. We know that they tortured people. We know that they tortured people and said, to the people they were torturing, like, tell us that Saddam has WMDs. So the people said yes, just so the U.S. would stop torturing them. Like, we know all this now because it's been revealed. So, like, the historians who then, talk about Iraq and still, give the propagandized narrative. It wasn't for oil. Saddam Hussein could have had WMDs. We were protecting our freedom, blah, 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 blah. Like, that's so disgusting because so much information has come out that we know that's not true. Or the historians who like defend the Vietnam War, who act like the U.S. were the good guys in the Cold War. Like, there's not that many historians who will defend Iraq right now because it was just 20 years ago or so, and we're still occupying them, and everyone knows it's a disaster. But there are ones that talk about Vietnam and Korea like the U.S. were the good guys. Like, you're out of your mind. We carpet bomb these countries for no reason, literally no reason, to stop the spread of communism, to stop the spread of democracy while claiming we're fighting for democracy. So and there's so many bourgeois historians who still argue this stuff. Yeah, famously, I got one of them to chain himself to the TikTok headquarters in protest of my existence. because I didn't want to talk about the Holodomor. I'm not supposed to talk about that guy. I'm sorry. Legally, Eddie is the goat. Thank you, but no. One day maybe. Carlos, you're glitchy, but I see you.
The whole the whole internet went out. So I'm testing out streaming through data. Is my voice like freezing? Is my image bad?
You're glitchy, but I can hear you.
Fine.
Your video's glitchy. I can hear your voice. Um, Run to Best Buy and grab an Ethernet USB extender in 8 minutes.
Yeah. With highly traffic, I can probably get it done in 8 days.
I can't believe your US or your laptop doesn't have one. That's frustrating.
Okay, the internet is back. This
Okay.
is fucking ridiculous, folks.
It is.
In China, like the internet is twice as quick, and it's only $25 a month.
Yes, dude. I found out today before we answer this question. I'd been paying a bill to MediaCom, like this terrible Wi-Fi company, for my old house. So $100 for 7 months for Wi-Fi that I wasn't using. So $700 I might as well flush down the toilet. And I called them today and they're gonna give me my money back. They're gonna write me a check because there was no data usage, so they knew that the Wi-Fi wasn't being used. I'm like, thank goodness. This is the first good experience I've had with the Wi-Fi companies ever. So make sure y'all don't just let that stuff go. Interrogate those companies and if they wouldn't have been agreeable and given me that money back, I would have like demanded it and fought it and threatened them. Like, you can do that, and these companies have the money. They'll pay you back. Like, they don't really give a shit. They just don't want to, have it become a hassle. But
Dude, I had to cancel the Wall Street Journal subscription that I was forced to get freshman year of undergrad. I had to cancel it like 3 times before they ended up canceling it. I was paying like 10, $15 a month for it. Um, yeah.
yeah, it sucks when you're paying for a subscription you're not using. So what are your thoughts on the growing phenomenon of Islamic socialism in the Arab world right now? Makes sense. It's socialism, with Arab characteristics. I'm supporter of it. Gaddafi kind of leaned in that direction. Big supporter of him. In Syria, like the Ba'athist Socialist Party. Um, so like, a lot of these Arab socialists, like Assad in Syria, they end up their countries get thrown into civil war because the U.S. is backing and arming like 50 different terrorist groups in Syria. And then Assad fights in the civil war and he becomes sort of like a war hero to his people. And then the U.S. socialists are like, oh, evil, terrorist Assad, he kills people and he's got a cult of personality. He's like, well, maybe if imperialism didn't put 50 different terrorist groups in his country, like what did you expect was going to happen? So there's a lot of smears and there's a lot of like purity fetishism that goes on with dismissing Arab socialism. But it's mostly, positive, way better than the forces of reaction in the Arab world. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's also like, we have to be able to distinguish. I was talking to a comrade about this yesterday. We have to be able to distinguish support based out of necessity and support based out of virtue, which means that there's certain countries that, because of their geopolitical position in their existence as an anti-imperialist country, as a country that's challenging U.S. NATO imperialism, we have to support them. Now, that doesn't mean that the sort of form that the mode of life that they embody is something that we should consider a virtuous form of socialism or something. We have to distinguish between supporting out of necessity, realizing that these countries are fighting imperialism, and then supporting out of virtue. And I think, in the case of like Iran and Russia, that's more so the case. That's what comes to mind. But
Yes, what the Tudeh party in Iran is like obviously who we would support, being in power. So they're the Communist Party, and they have been for a while. Or I don't know if because they used to be super super powerful, and they faced like repression, infiltration by the CIA. They supported Mossadegh, who the CIA overthrew in Iran, one of their first coups in the early 50s. And the Tudeh party was big in allowing Mossadegh to come to power. Um, but since then they've been weakened by imperialism and CIA repression. But Iran's system, like someone said, Khomeini said, no usury. Like Iran's Islamic economic and social system is pretty similar to socialism. Like 70% of their industry and banks are like owned by the state. And they have these poverty alleviation programs. They try and combat the brutal U.S. sanction regime that they're under. They don't allow usury and predatory loan practices. So yeah, in the context that they're fighting imperialism, that they're allying with socialist countries, we should support them, even if it's not our preferred party in Iran who happens to be in power. It's all
That's
about material, you know where these countries find themselves materially positioned in relation to the other countries.
okay. I think we have the Troika comrade. He
Oh,
just made it. His camera and mic are off though.
am I supposed to stick around for this, Carlos? Wasn't this just a you thing? Should I head out?
I don't know whatever you want to do. I think that if you want to help with the things, you could do it as well. But we had talked about doing a dual stream through TikTok. So if that's what you want to hop over and do, that's fine as well.
Right, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to intrude. So I'll probably just hop out then. But nice talking with you, comrade. Enjoy your time with the Troika comrades and everyone else.
Always good talking to you. And I'm good. This served as the sort of dress rehearsal to get the Wi-Fi working. Hopefully it stays up good. But
Yeah, hopefully you'll be all right now. I'm sending you strong Wi-Fi signals with my brain.
oh, I appreciate that.
That's the power of
Need
communism.
it. Yes.
Yep. All right, peace. See you, everyone.
See ya. Comrade Danielle, um, do you hear me? I see a John Green crash course. We'll react to that this weekend. We hope to do some streams, react to some stuff. Um, Hopefully Eddie, I, and Noah. It should be fun. I especially want to react to those China videos. Um, it was pretty mind blowing just to see the amount of development. And given that it's a socialist society headed by a communist party with more than 100 million members, the development of wealth is not coupled with the development of poverty on the other side. Um, so it's really nice to see a society without homelessness, where the living standard is such that even if you have a minimum wage job, you're able to save half of your paycheck at the end of the month. I heard there were students from the U.S. heading over to China to work simply because that's the only way they could really pay back their student loans, because they can save at the minimum half of their paycheck. Um, what's up, folks? We got Professor Q in the room. Nice dining room. Thank you. It's a petty bourgeois dining room. uh, I definitely need Xi Jinping to hook us up with good Wi-Fi. Okay, folks. So it's 7 o'clock going on. We're gonna have Comrade Libre, Comrade Libre Sankara from Troika Collective. We had him on with Comrade Ymir a few weeks back after the victory of Gustavo Petro, and it was the, I think, 11th day of the protests in Ecuador when we talked to Comrade Libre and Ymir. Now he's heading this event down here in South Florida. Oh, Comrade Libre, hello.
It's already Bluetooth connected, homie. Yo,
What's up? How's it going?
bien y tú?
Hi.
Hello, good to meet you.
Huh?
I'm saying plug it into this.
No,
It's
it's
louder.
Bluetooth connected to
No,
that.
it's not. It's not coming out of here.
You can hear me, homie?
Yeah, I could hear you guys. The Comrade Daniel from Belly of the Beast, he was just on and he hopped off.
Okay, I was trying to tell him that it wasn't his internet connection, that it was that the show wasn't started. So you can hear me?
Yeah. We've been running the stream for like 40 something minutes because it helps people filter in. But he can hop back on now if he's ready. You have a very dramatic look there with the black and white going.
Turn that light off behind you, Lisa. No, actually, I didn't. Do they show up on screen? Yeah, they do.
Just want we just got on, and Carlos said he saw.
Yeah.
I think it's
The
clear.
lights on.
No, off. Huh?
Is that bright enough, right?
Yeah, this is bright enough because we got the screen.
Make sure the camera's tilted in a way that you don't see people behind you.
It's only the wall.
There's gonna be people.
No, you need a clap, dog. You sound stressed, homie.
Because I'm planning an event and trying to get it started, yes.
We're live right now, by the way, Comrade.
Oh,
No. You always sound stressed.
got you, homie.
Yeah, you chill, bro. I got some ears.
Comrade Daniel is on now.
Glad
He's got
we're
his camera and mic off though.
got you, homie.
What?
Libre, if you're in touch with Daniel, let him know that he can turn his.
You sure they're not in
He's-
the room?
Yeah, he's getting ready to hop on right now. I just confirmed.
Okay.
And then Carlos, you unfortunately haven't gotten to meet the homie Dailing, but she's also another revolutionary Cuban comrade based here in Miami.
Hello, good to meet you.
How are you, Carlos?
Good, and
Nice
you?
to meet you too. What part of Cuba is your family from?
Havana.
You know what part of Havana?
No, I'm not sure. I haven't gone back. I came when I was little. I was 4 years old when I got here. And when I went back, I was like 8. So I haven't gone. I was hoping to go in 2020, but the pandemic interfered. But now we're hoping to, as a project, perhaps start doing some brigades to socialist countries. And we think that Cuba might be the first or second one. We have one set to Venezuela in November that Eddie's going to be going to. But I hope to go back soon. It's my homeland. I want to go back.
Okay, Daniel says he's backstage.
I can add him to the stream, but it says that his camera is off.
You muted?
I'm hoping I don't have any Wi-Fi issues. I was having some earlier, but I relocated to a place that's surrounded by 3 Wi-Fi extenders. So I'm hoping everything's good. Thank you, Doctor or RD Doctor, for the $2 donation. Is multipolarity progressive? I'd say yes, especially the sort of multipolarity that we're experiencing today with the East rising and the global South It's got definitely a left wing and at times a very explicitly socialist tint to it. So it's definitely a whole lot better than the life-devouring hegemony of the American empire and of NATO. So I would definitely say it's progressive.
So while we work through some of the technical difficulties and wait for our comrade Daniel to hop on, maybe there we go. Look at God. And also they said their signal's a little bit iffy, but obviously we can expect that. But we'll just kind of work through that and navigate things. I'll go ahead and kind of lay some base foundation for folks that are on right now. So first of all, welcome. I'm Libre ex Sankara.
Dalen.
And we're joining y'all on behalf of Troika Collective. We have our comrade Carlos from Midwestern Marx and Daniel that will be joining us from Cuba. They form part of Belly of the Beast, which is an investigative journalism collective that does some really dope work to combat the lies and misconceptions that we are often told about the country of Cuba. So today, for this panel, we'll be covering abortion rights in Cuba. We'll be covering brigades. Myself and Dailing have both been on brigades to Cuba, different brigades, and we'll also be covering why it's important to be in solidarity with Cuba to end the blockade, the illegal U.S. blockade of Cuba. And we'll be coming from different perspectives. So Troika Collective, Midwestern Marx, and Belly of the Beast, we all come from our different perspectives. But the thing that we can agree on is lifting the blockade on Cuba. And dispelling misinformation about Cuba, so that we can get closer to the truth and be in true solidarity with the millions of Cubans that are in the country of Cuba. And so we will hopefully be answering questions that folks might have, as well as learning together. Because even with all the knowledge that will be on this panel, we don't know everything that there is to know about Cuba. But we will hopefully offer enough information to get closer to a truth, and also to lift the blockade. And so we're gonna make some space for the comrades to introduce themselves. So I'm gonna hand it over to Dalen. Then we'll go to Daniel, and then we'll end with Carlos.
So I think bringing in this kind of perspective, especially living in places like Miami in the United States, of all places, it's important to understand the fact that there is a Cuban population in the U.S. and outside of Cuba that still are in support of the Cuban Revolution. And it is extremely important to dispel those myths, to be able to strengthen the Cuban Revolution and its continuous project in developing its people, and also being able to help the people abroad inside Cuba in order to combat the illegal blockade that it's currently creating a genocide in the country.
And we'll have Carlos go, and hopefully in the meantime, Daniel will have enough signal to respond.
Do you want me to just make some introductory comments, or what is it that you want me to comment on?
Just a brief introduction to who you are, and the org Midwestern Marx and the work that you all do.
Yeah, so like Dailing, I'm a Cuban American. I came here when I was little. I was 4 years old, and I was raised my whole life in Miami with people telling me how bad Cuba was and how much of a failure socialism was. And then I encountered, when my little sister was born, a situation where my mother needed a surgery badly, and she had to weigh two options: either get the surgery and go into life crippling debt for the rest of her life, or just roll on with it. And she had to roll on with it. I didn't really understand it, because the same people that were saying that Cuba sucks and that Cuba is the worst country in the world were telling her, just go to Cuba and get the operation there. And although I was quite young, it didn't really make any sense to me. It didn't make any sense that we were in the wealthiest nation on earth, the one that these people praised so much, and then they kept on telling my mom to go to Cuba. It also didn't make sense that they're the ones that hate Cuba the most, but they were traveling, 2-3 times a year to Cuba as tourists to have their fun. But anyways, I got involved in 2016 in the Bernie campaign, and started to make sense how it was that the interest of private insurance and for-profit interest led to some of the conditions that I had experienced with my mother, and some of the other health problems that my family has had. Eventually, what ends up happening is that after I graduate with Eddie, we end up creating Midwestern Marx as a Marxist educational project, which centers something that we didn't really see too prevalent in the hegemonic DSA Jacobin left, which is anti-imperialism, right? In 2019, there was a socialism conference in Chicago, and we were shocked by the fact that some of the speakers were denouncing Venezuela, Nicaragua, China, Cuba as dictatorships, and not in the way that we use the concepts in the Marxist-Leninist tradition, in a very derogatory manner. So we created our project to have Marxist education that's casting as wide a net as possible, right? My co-founder, Eddie Smith, he started from the beginning making 1-minute TikToks explaining Marxist theory to hundreds of thousands of people online, and critiquing imperialist propaganda, shattering imperialist propaganda. But we also have our website where we publish nearly 100 articles a week. We have a publishing press where we publish scholarly books from Marxist theorists and militants. We have a scholarly journal of American Socialist Studies, which attempts from an interdisciplinary outlook to reformulate the radical history of the U.S. and show that, although it's been ignored and whitewashed in history textbooks, that we have a history of struggle against empire and against capitalism and against racism. So we try to cast our net as wide as possible, which includes videos and interviews and events like this, because we feel like we are at a historic conjuncture where the objective conditions for a qualitative change in society are as ripe as ever. And it's up to us to create the subjective conditions in the masses to help them understand that the problems that they feel on an everyday basis are not sourced in a specific policy of a specific politician. They are systemic. They are rooted in the mode of life that governs our economic production, that governs our state and its civil institutions, that unless we change and create a movement that puts working people in charge of their future, we're going to continue to suffer under a system that puts profits over people and planet. And the struggle against the blockade in Cuba, the struggle against the American propaganda on Cuba, it's interlinked at its core with the struggle that we have at home against empire and against the forces that oppress us here and that exploit us here, because they are the same capitalist monopolists that are waging wars across the world, that are keeping our lives here in very dire conditions, where 80% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Half of Americans are in a condition where they're a lost paycheck away from homelessness. And this is completely absurd. It's the same forces that keep the blockade on Cuba that keep us like this. So our battles are intertwined. And that's why, we support Cuba. And besides the fact that I'm also Cuban myself. So I hope that's enough for an introduction.
That's great. Our comrade Daniel is on again. Daniel, ¿no escucha? We'll work through it, and hopefully it'll work out. I'll just give a brief introduction. Also, like I said, myself and Deiling are part of Troika Collective, founded and based here in Miami, but we also have members in New York as well as LA. And our purpose is to combat imperialist lies with working class truth. So highlighting our comrades, working class comrades, not only here on Turtle Island, this stolen land from indigenous people and new African people, but also supporting the global South and dispelling those lies. We also believe that revolution is possible and should be waged, and revolutionary warfare should be waged wherever there are working class people, including here on Turtle Island. And so we also fight for working class people here, highlighting working class narratives here on Turtle Island. And our name, just to be clear, our name Troika comes from an American politician, John Bolton, saying Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are the Troika of evil. And so we take this name and say that we are the Troika of resistance, the Troika of socialism. And so today we're gonna dive into the first topic as our homie Daniel Hapsan will be able to get an investigative journalism perspective. Again, all three groups are coming from possibly different perspectives. We don't entirely agree on everything that's gonna necessarily be shared in terms of maybe some ideological points or whatnot, but we all collectively agree that we do need to end the blockade, and we are in solidarity with the Cuban people. And that is the thing that we are clear about. So we're gonna dive into the first aspect of today's discussion, which is abortion rights, and then we're gonna tie that into the healthcare system that exists in Cuba, as well as women's rights. And so we're gonna start with the simple facts, right? Since 1965, abortions have been legal in Cuba. Legal. Like, this is law. Every person that reaches reproductive age in Cuba is when they reach reproductive age, which means whenever they have their first menstrual cycle, they're able to go into the clinic, meet with a doctor, and choose which contraceptives they would like to use, if they would like to use contraceptives. And if at any point they need to get an abortion, it is free and legal. And let me just share a few more facts to hopefully ground us a little bit more in why this is so important, besides the fact that that the rights of women and femmes here on Turtle Island are under attack with the recent Roe v. Wade. And so when we're talking about reproductive rights in Cuba, abortion was technically legalized in Cuba in 1936 in the case of rape, or if there was risk to the birth giver's life. And before the 1959 revolution, Cubans lived through neocolonialism. So most people that had access to abortions prior to the revolution were people that could afford to go to private clinics. And this is something where people from the U.S. would go to Cuba to get abortions. Again, from a class perspective, folks that could afford to get an abortion. Now, after, and also Cuba suffered the second highest rural infant and maternal mortality rates in Latin America because most Cubans did not have access to healthcare, again, prior to the revolution. So what does the revolution bring about? Well, after the 59 revolution, we see immediate improvement in not only literacy through literacy campaigns, but also health outcomes, where the reality in Cuba now is that that Cuba has the most doctors per capita in the world, some of the best doctors and healthcare system in the world. And as of 1965, free and full access to abortions based off of four main principles. 1, it's a woman who decides. 2, it needs to take place at a hospital. 3, it needs to be carried out by expert staff. And 4, it needs to be totally free. So these are the stipulations for free abortions in Cuba. And the only criminalization of abortion in Cuba is if it's done for profit outside of a health institution and not by a medical staff or against a woman's will. So when we're talking about why this would be the case and why a country like Cuba would do this, we also have to understand that Cuba has a lot of dynamics that do not exist in the U.S. For one, the Cuban Federation of Women, which will be touched on very shortly by our comrade over here, has a membership of 85%. So 85% of all Cuban women over the age of 40 or over the age of 14 are part of the Cuban Federation of Women that participate in a process of determining law and policy that is passed in the country of Cuba. And so I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully that gives folks an idea of the healthcare system in Cuba, specifically focusing around access to abortion rights, and also understanding that when we're talking about this thing called democracy, right? This thing called democracy and freedom, why is it that Cuba, a country that has offered free abortion since 1965, why is it that we say that that country is a bad country, and the U.S., which claims to be the pillar of democracy and claims to export democracy to other countries, is a country that, as of recently, took away people's right to an abortion? And I think those are things to think about when we're talking about working class struggle and people's abilities to have access to rights. In the U.S., under U.S. imperialism, we find that rights are made into privileges. In a country like Cuba, we find that rights are made accessible. It is not a crime to be poor in Cuba. In fact, a poor person in Cuba has access to housing, has access to healthcare, has access to education, all free of cost, and has access to food, although that is limited because of something that we'll be touching on later, which is the blockade. And if we understand the way that this country moves, a lot of working class people here on Turtle Island in the US should be questioning, why is it that Cuba has everything that we're out in the streets fighting for right now, and it is a so-called third world country, and we in a so-called first world country have none of these things guaranteed to us by law? And so I'm going to hand it over to our comrade Dailing, and she'll dive more into the women's revolution and the role of women in the Cuban Revolution.
So first and foremost, I would want to discuss the fact that the legalized abortions and the rights that took place after the 1959 revolution was not just circumstantial, and it was based on the bigger fact that it was towards a women's liberation movement in a socialist dynamic. And in the first place, Cuba was the first country in all of Latin America to legalize abortions. And before the revolution in Cuba, I think you might have looked up, I'm not sure.
No, you're still live. He's just highlighting you.
Oh, before the revolution in Cuba, the access to healthcare was terrible. There was like one doctor in an entire rural country, and you would have to travel miles and miles to even be seen by a doctor. The maternal death rates, the child mortality rates were extremely high. And it wasn't up until Fidel Castro and his revolution and the revolution of campesinos and women, of Black people, people of Cuba, joined together to create this movement towards an idealized world where the poor would not, as what Livia said, the poor weren't criminalized. So abortion was illegalized, and it was the first country to be legal, first Latin American country to be legalized in a free, accessible way. And as Livia said, the only way that it would be criminalized is if it weren't done in a procedure outside of the hospital. And also, what I would also like to talk about is the fact that Cuba, the culture of abortions in Cuba is not as stigmatized as what you would see here in the United States. That kind of sex education and access to contraceptives is not as taboo as it is seen here in the U.S., where many people would argue to say that teens and young adults should not be taught those things within a school setting. But in Cuba, they are very well taught on that and very informed of that. So, and adding on to the Federation of FMC, the Federation of Cuban Women, which actually added on to and helped the addition of legalized abortions. The revolutionary feminism existed in Cuba, and that's the basis of what feminism is in Cuba, Marxist feminist movements. And it is based on a class struggle where we see the role of the female as completely and totally revolutionized in a socialist setting. The Federation of Cuban Women was an amalgamation of what the previous women's movements had already set apart in Cuba in the revolution. The FMC planted sanitary brigades in 1964 to promote local healthcare access to deliveries, and it coordinated with farmers to be able to help give women labor roles after the 59 revolution. There were mutual aid brigades in 1966 that also were mainly led by women, as well as the literacy brigades, but were also mainly led by women as well. There also was a militant mothers for education system that was added onto the FMC that helped mothers be extremely more kind of involved with the school setting, that allowed for school grounds to be more monitored by women as well. And they also mandated the Feminine Front, which helped employment for commissions for women working in the new labor field after the revolution as well. And there was also this specific program called Círculos Infantiles, which still exists today in Cuba. So as a working class woman in Cuba, you're given free access for daycare settings, which here we know in the United States is extremely expensive. Paying daycare for your child is just adding on to the more expenses you already have as a working class family. In Cuba, you are able to bring your child in if they are not yet in school age. So before the age of 5 or 6, I think, when they enter school. During those ages, and you're able to work and be able to drop off your child at a daycare center for free, extremely free. And adding on to this perspective in the liberal feminist movement here in the U.S. that exists, especially what we saw recently with the Supreme Court decisions. And I saw a lot of people still have this sentiment towards the policy and mechanism of trying to hold these rights through these same institutions that uphold patriarchy in the first place. The liberal feminist movement here is very attached to the idea of voting and being able to do it through the system itself. And I think Cuba is a great example of what true women's liberation can look like and what an inspiration of that. Even though it's 90 miles away, people are still so intact into this system and thinking that there is only a solution through this mechanism and through these concepts of the United States. If you want to talk about more about family codes, maybe.
Oh, yeah. So we can dive into, and this was touched on, the family code. So oftentimes people's critiques of Cuba is that they don't have democracy and the people are forced to do X, Y, and Z, when in fact Cuba has a policy where they are in a consistent process of rewriting their constitution, of which we have never done in this country. We have never rewritten our constitution. Cuba is in a constant process of rewriting their constitution through a process of family codes. What the family codes is a truly democratic process, and in fact, something that countries can look to as an example of ways that you can create more democratic laws. The family codes is something that happens is a process that happens with millions of Cubans, and not only Cubans that live in Cuba. This is a process that is done with Cubans that live outside of Cuba that call in and give insight into how we should be changing our laws based on the current state of things. For example, part of the new family codes that will be set forth are gonna aim to make same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption, something that is not only legal under law, but also incorporated into aspects of school curriculum to get rid of this idea that a household or that a family is only comprised of a woman and a man, and make it more inclusive. Obviously, this is not something that all of Cubans agree with, but again, this is a democratic process. So a majority of Cubans understand that the new world, the current world, and the current setting that we live in is asking for this to be a reality because the LGBTQ community needs to be incorporated in. And this is done through a process of the family codes where we can correct, where Cuba's in a process of constantly correcting and critiquing the system that they currently have to improve it and be more reflective of the society now, like the here and the now. So it's a constant process, and then Comrade will dive into a little bit more.
So the family codes were actually first implemented in the late 1975. So the first family codes that were installed were based on things like marriage and divorce and spouses' commitment to their children, and exercising their abilities to work outside of the house as well for both parents, either female or both of the spouses in the houses. So the family code, even in the 1975 version, millions of people had to participate and were organized and participating and had various meetings upon meetings upon meetings to be drafted and to have all of the opinions of the Cuban people in order to have that set in stone in their policies. And the new family code that's being drafted currently is kind of like a revision towards the one that was already implemented in the 1975 version. And so in this version, as Liva said, there is things that are being addressed like same-sex marriage, civil unions, being able to adopt children. And also one interesting one that is currently being debated is the fact that children are now not being seen as property of their parents, but also having specific rights of them. So children are now seen as proper rights and individuals that have to be given the same rights as any other Cuban, even though they are a minor. So again, this has extensive consultations and has been monitored by and organized by over 6 million Cubans. And there's been, I think, around 79,000 meetings upon this. Obviously, of course, taken over the course of years since it has been drafted. And recently, I think there is a new update on it. I think it's in September of 2022 is when they will be drafting and putting in the final draft of the family code. I think the progress of the Cuban people and the fact that in the Constitution of Cuba itself, the fact that it has multiple statements and multiple clauses addressing women's rights, addressing the fact that a woman has the right against sex discrimination, that does not exist in the U.S. Constitution. And most people may be surprised by that fact, but there is no explicit statement that a woman or anyone is protected against sex discrimination. There was a debate in the 1970s about the Equal Rights Amendment, which never got to be passed in the first place. And it still is being debated on it, whether it being passed or not. But look at Cuba, over 30, 40, 50, 60 years of women being addressed and explicitly guaranteed of their rights as people, I think is a testament to the fact that the women's rights and women's liberation movement extends beyond the constraints of what the U.S. and Western progression has made it seem like.
Thank you, Comrade. And we'll also share where we got some of these resources from outside of actually going to Cuba and talking to Cubans and hearing about how they've actively built this out. But we're going to make some space. We're going to jump to Comrade Carlos to answer a few questions that we have here. So as a Cuban being born in Cuba and growing up in Miami, Can you dive into what that reality is? Because I think part of the issue in the U.S. is also breaking this monolithic view of Cuban, right? And that to be Cuban is automatically viewed as being against the Cuban government, and all these other stereotypes that that a lot of Cubans, but not all Cubans, and we have to be very specific. There's no monolithic view, and in fact, there is a fairly large movement of Cubans that are against the blockade, right? So this even pushes back against the idea of the monolithic Cuban. So can you dive into growing up in Miami, your experiences, what you've been able to observe being a Cuban that grew up in Miami?
Well, I grew up in the culture that it was predominant here, and it was fine until I started seeing the cracks in the worldview that predominates here, and then eventually I came to see that the whole worldview is really upside down, right? There's no factual foundation for a lot of the things that sustain it. So after that sort of shift towards it comes around the same time as I start considering myself a socialist. But after that sort of shift that I make towards being a supporter of the Cuban Revolution, towards being against the blockade in Cuba, although I was technically always against the blockade. My parents were against the blockade growing up. When that shift takes place, it's really difficult because all the people that I had relationships here, they all were in the same place. They're all anti-Cuba, and I had relations with people who I'd go practice baseball with their parents, with their dad, whose dad, for instance, made them stop practicing with me or playing baseball with me because after every training session, he would go to his dad and tell him, "Hey, what about this? What about that?" And then his dad, a lot of the times, wouldn't be able to respond. So it was easier to cut the relationship with me than to continue arguing for his upside down worldview that's not based on any facts. So it's been a difficult process, but I mean the truth is the truth, and the reality is that Cuba is a country that was under colonial domination for more than 2 centuries. That ever since the end of the 18th century, it's been the sugar hub of the world. And in the 1860s, not only is it forced monocropping by Spain, which has led to conditions where the UN has recognized that 75% of the arable land in Cuba is under soil erosion because of those centuries of colonial monocropping. But ever since the 1860s, it was not only a dependence on sugar, but a dependence on trading sugar with the US, which is naturally its geographical trading partner. And so when the Spanish-American War takes place, or when the Cuban War of Independence takes place in 1898, the U.S. intervenes with a sprinkle of yellow journalism and occupies Cuba for 3 years. And then that's something that it would eventually do for 3 more times until the revolution took place, which includes a continual occupation of Guantanamo Bay since 1903, which is the U.S.'s favorite torture spot. So this is the context that Cuba emerges in, and that the revolution takes place in, under land that has been destroyed of its fruitfulness in large part because of colonial practices of monocropping and agriculture, under a global system which forces every country to participate in international trade. And under these conditions, the U.S., for the simple fact that Cuba was tired of having its lands, its resources, its major corporations and industries owned by American multinationals, and for the simple fact that they wanted to distribute those resources and have a Cuba that is genuinely for Cubans, the U.S. began this savage, predatory blockade that has been condemned for 30 years straight by the United Nations. And that's been the relationship that Cuba has had to the largest empire humanity has known in history. And we have to be clear, the blockade is a monster of great size. We shouldn't undermine it, but we should also not forget that the blockade is not the only tool that the U.S. has used to attempt to destabilize Cuba. We know that since 1860, right after the revolution, Lester Mallory, which was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, said quite clearly, the Cuban people are in favor of the revolution. If we want regime change in Cuba, we're going to have to make their economic conditions so unbearable that they open themselves up to the idea of fighting against their own government. And in that moment, we'll be there ready to fund them and to propagate the ideas so that they go against their government. This spirit, this philosophy, this by any means necessary approach to the US's treatment with Cuba has been consistent for the last 60 years. We've seen not just the blockade that is criminal to a country that has been forced through centuries of colonialism to participate in international trade, and that when it's able to do international trade, a lot of the times it has to do it under unfavorable conditions, where it has to either buy at higher prices and sell at lower prices so that the countries or the corporations that they participate in trade with, so that it's favorable for them to bear the effects of what the US is going to do to them if they break the sanctions on Cuba. So these are the conditions that Cuba has been in, and it hasn't really just been the blockade. We know about the Bay of Pigs, which was a military invasion. We know about the operations which have been of biochemical nature, where the African swine flu was spread in Cuba in the early 70s. That was reported at the time by Covert Action magazine and by former CIA officials, which was, they confirmed that it was something the CIA did in Cuba. We have also know that there's people who are quite praised here in Miami, people like Luis Posada Gadrils and Orlando Bosch, who are terrorists who blew up a plane and killed 73 people. These are people that have been promoted by the empire, that the empire hasn't sanctioned, and that have done terroristic activity against civilians. We also know that there has been more than 600 attempts at Fidel's life. And I think most surprisingly for most Americans is Operation Northwood from 1962, where the US quite literally said that they should probably bomb Miami and Tampa and blame it on the Cubans in order to use it as a justification to go to war against Cuba. So all of these instruments are up for grab for the empire, and they have been consistently used. And I think perhaps one of the most effective ones is the media, both mainstream and social media. And we saw that at play in the protest on July 11th of 2021. The media really deserves the MVP that day, because they were disseminating photos left and right, some from Egypt, some from Argentina, some from Venezuela, but they were saying that it was Cuba. They were disseminating photos from years past saying that Raul Castro was fleeing the country, when that was a picture from 2014 or something. So they have been able to manipulate, as the good lapdogs of empire do, the narrative so that people buy into the idea that Cuba is undemocratic, that Cuba is poor because socialism doesn't work. And I'd like to ask him a question. If socialism doesn't work, why do you have to spend so many resources and so much time trying to make sure that it doesn't work, trying to make sure that the people overthrow their government? And why is it that after 60 years of an internationally condemned blockade, Cubans are still fighting for their revolution? Why is it that the Cuban masses still play a popular and protagonist role in the construction of socialism in their country? Why is it that in 2019, when the referendum for a new constitution came about, tens of thousands of meetings were waged, more than 90% of the population participated, and then more than 90% voted in favor of the new socialist constitution? Why is that the reality? And we have to realize that the Cuban people are in favor overwhelmingly of the revolutionary process, and that they understand very clearly that the demands that they have, some of the concrete difficulties that they experience on an everyday basis, is not the fault of socialism. It's not the fault of the government. It's the fault of the imperialist blockade, which is dynamic and which exploits conditions such as the pandemic to make the living conditions of Cubans worse, to do what Lester Mallory already said since 1960 that they would try to do: pin Cuban people against the government through the harshness that they can impose on their everyday life through an economic blockade. And the reality is that Cuban people continue to fight, but it is the duty of us living in the belly of the beast to fight against this, because as I mentioned at the beginning, the same people which keep Americans living paycheck to paycheck, where if they lose one paycheck, they're in homelessness. The same people which keep 600,000 Americans living in the streets, homeless, which is the most undignified condition a human being can be in. Meanwhile, there's 10 times as many homes for each one of those homeless people. The same people destroying the planet and keeping the work that we do here meaningless and alienating. These are the same people which continue to promote the blockade on Cuba. These are the same people that, regardless of whether the administration is Democratic or Republican, since they are the puppet masters, they continue to manipulate the puppets into favoring policies that are against Cuba and in favor of an internationally condemned blockade. We have to realize that the problem is not one of policy. It's not one of specific politicians. It's not one of a specific party. The problem is systemic. And the reality is that the heart of the capitalist imperialist system, which the US represents, cannot have under its nose 90 miles away a society which prioritizes human life and the planet over profit. They cannot have that society succeed. They have to paint the picture very grim towards its own citizens and do everything they can in order to overthrow that society. And what we have in an event like July 11, 2021, when people hit the streets, is the realization that they have utterly failed. They have spent the last 2 decades, as Tracy Eaton's Cuba Money Project shows, spending more than $1 billion on dissident groups and media in Cuba and in Miami. They have spent the last 10 years spending more than 300 million of US taxpayer money in destabilizing Cuba. And all they were able to do was get a few hundred people in various provinces in Cuba to hit the streets, which quickly, like when you open a restaurant at night and there's a bunch of rats and you turn on the lights and they just skirmish in order to hide. Very quickly, right after Diaz-Canel said revolutionaries hit the streets, they were dwarfed by hundreds of thousands of Cubans, which then repeated those parades on the 17th of July, when more than 100,000 of them were in the streets. And they tried again in November to do something similar, and they utterly failed. So, sorry.
I think just like adding on to that, right? We're in Miami, right? Miami, like thousands of people thousands of gusanos, we'll just call it what it is. Thousands of gusanos hit the street to like try to, again, push this narrative. But it's really interesting that, we're talking about misinformation, right? It's real interesting that they use pictures of people that were out in favor of the government, saying that it was anti-government protesters, because when you compare the numbers, there really wasn't that many Cubans out going against the government. And those that were receiving US NED and USAID funds. Mm-hmm. And this is a fact. And so when people, it also like pushes back, right? Like it is a fact. People did get arrested, right? But if you break law and if you're taking money from another government to overthrow your government, yes, there are consequences for that. I'm sorry, people. But if you're trying to overthrow a democratic revolution of the masses of people and you fail at that, you're going to get locked up. Hate to break it to you. You pick a side and you deal with the consequences. And the masses of Cubans, the millions of Cubans in Cuba, are in favor of the government and being, protagonists of the revolution that they fought for, and dealing with the contradictions that come with having to deal with the secondary effects of colonization. Because the reality is, Cuba is not a perfect country, but Cuba is a country that has democracy and is able to address the contradictions. In a country like Cuba, you are able to address racism because you are systematically using a different form of governance that does not necessitate slavery, that does not necessitate exploitation. Capitalism does. We can't even have a conversation around racism in the US because some people deny it. And then also, we're not using anything that's systematically different from the foundation of this country. Nothing has systematically changed. We can't even have the conversation. Versus a place like Cuba that is in an active process of addressing things like misogyny, like patriarchy, like racism. Why? Because they're using a system that humanizes people, that gives people their rights, and that censors the most marginalized people. And this is why people, like even people that, let's just be honest, just because like Cuba's a country full of people with different opinions. People don't not everybody agrees on the same things. But what everybody in Cuba does agree on, for the most part, is that no one is asking for no U.S. intervention. The only people that happen to be asking for U.S. intervention are people like Francis Suarez, who fuck him, right? Because he's like, maybe we should consider bombing. What?
Bombing under the guise of humanitarian intervention. He said we should not forget, we should not remove off of the table drone strikes under our humanitarian intervention approach. That's what freedom for the U.S. means. It means drone strikes. For Cuba, it means exporting doctors and making the masses, as you mentioned, protagonists in the construction of the revolution. You mentioned the using of pro-revolution crowds. There was this beautiful interview with Ted Cruz, our favorite vampire, Cuban American. There was an interview he was doing in on Fox News, and they had these massive crowds right behind him, but they were blurring the signs. And what did you see when you unblurred those signs? What did the signs say? They said, "Patria muerte venceremos," and the other one said, "Revolutionaries hit the streets." So the image right after then was one of Southwest Miami, in front of a famous restaurant whose name is slipping, but they had nothing. They had nothing because instantly everyone went away. And it's so clear that it's an utter failure. They've spent so much money. They've spent so much time and effort trying to destabilize Cuba and fund dissident groups inside. And they achieved nothing on July 11th. They achieved nothing on November, even less than on July. If July was bad, November was horrible, right? But they still needed it in order to justify to the media. They had 2 weeks before that was the United Nations General Assembly vote on the blockade in Cuba. And for the
184 countries, just like voted.
Every country.
Clear. Only Israel and the U.S. and fuck Israel, because it's not a real thing, is not real, like Free Palestine, right? But Israel and the U.S. were the only two countries that voted. So tell me, 2 countries versus 184. Why is there still a blockade on Cuba?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I was actually in Cuba yesterday. Less than 24 hours ago, I was in Cuba. I stayed there for about 2 weeks, and I was there during the July 11th 1-year anniversary. The streets were normal. I knew there was. I'm not sure if there were like Miami protests here, like
there was a little one.
A way to like say, hey, like, this is like a representation of what's happening in Cuba, because it's in reality not happening at all. If you talk to the average Cuban and talk to them about what happened in July 11th, they will straight up tell you no one is here to support them, because at the end of the day, what they want is U.S. annexation. And the Cubans will fight to the death for their sovereignty, no matter what, no matter if it's political, ideological discussion, debates, disagreements, they will fight to their end for their sovereignty, especially if it comes to American imperialism. I think the social media aspect of what happened in July 11th was a complete failure of the reactionary side. Again, as you mentioned, there was direct propaganda of, blurring those sides and blurring those protests, because the people here in the U.S., the government does not want you to know that Cubans in Cuba support the revolution. There is a reason why millions of Cubans, over 85% of the Cuban population is part of the CDR, has a membership of the CDR. The Cubans in Cuba are completely supported and are completely educated of the struggle that it takes to build and to continue the revolution that continues to be in Cuba. I was speaking to my cousin.
The committee for the defense of the revolution.
Yes.
The CDR.
I was speaking to my cousin. I was just talking to him about the July 11th protest, because I spoke to every family member about that. Because it was, it's a big tough. And he was like, the people that mainly staged that in the July 11th protest, people are saying that there were many prisoners that were imprisoned in Cuba. And he told me that many of the people that led it are now here in the United States, that there was some deal that they made there, that they sent those dissidents back into the U.S. where they wanted to be in the first place. And they are no longer helping the supposed Cuban dissident movement that is occurring in Cuba. And there's this debate of what's occurring is like, are their hearts really in for the improvement of the Cuban situation. They're not. Their hearts are in, at the end of the day, the Yankees are in for American money, American imperialism, and American enrichment. And that's just the case, and that's always been the case, but even before the 1959 revolution.
And it's very interesting to see the U.S. talk about police repression in Cuba, in a country where the police kills thousands of citizens every fucking year. And if you're black and brown, the percentage of you getting killed by the police is much higher. That's very absurd. In Cuba, the cops don't even really carry guns, which is another thing.
I saw that.
And they don't carry guns. And I saw that, well, it was shown at the time. I had published an article for Covert Action magazine where I covered all of the sort of covert tactics that were used by the empire leading up to the July 11 protests. One of them was literally bribing people through WhatsApp to beat themselves up and then record a video and say that it was the police. And there was people that did this. There was a Facebook group for the people that had been disappeared by the government. Most of those people were found, and they had interviews in Cuba Debate right after. And they asked, like, hey, are you disappeared? They're like, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. I've been here the whole time, and I'm pretty mad about them using my image for those sorts of things. So we have to remember that these are the people that, like, praise Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carrillo. Like, there's nothing that's, like, out of, beyond limits for them. They're willing to do everything, bribe people, do whatever they have to do in order to promote their narrative so that Cuba goes back to being what it was when they really enjoyed it, which is Sin City, a small little Vegas where American monopoly capital had control over the island. Most Cubans lived poor, but a very small strata of Cubans, usually the white ones, lived quite well. That's what the Cuba that they want. That's why they're mad. And those are the people that are here that came after the revolution because they were expropriated, and their lands were given back to the Cuban people.
And also, just for the sake of investigative journalism and using information that was well researched, right? If folks are interested in an analysis of July 11th, right? Like I said, you got to pick a side and you have to deal with the consequences. There are people that are locked up. That's just a reality. Also, we have to understand the U.S. doesn't mind sacrificing people, right? So I'm sure the U.S. bribed some people, told them they were going to help them, and then just left them there. And now they're locked up, wondering when the U.S. is going to come help them out. But look at Belly of the Beast. So our investigative journalist, Daniel, is not able to join us because of connection issues. But we will be doing other events, and hopefully next time they'll be able to join us. So they apologize. But right, go to the Instagram, watch the series that they've worked on called War. What is it? War on Cuba.
The War on Cuba.
And yeah, watch that because it gives you a good idea of all the views, right? And they even interview somebody that got locked up in the July, like Carlos was saying, somebody that was locked up, and he's like, I've been locked up before, this is what we can expect, but I didn't fear for my life. And that's the narrative that is being pushed out through the West, right? That Cubans cannot disagree with anything, and you have to be a fidelista to the hardcore, and you have to the same things they do in North Korea. Like, you have to dress like Fidel Castro by law, just dumb shit, right? And that's not the reality. Again, you're talking to two people that have recently been to Cuba. Comrade was born there, and Daniel is there. And so, right, we need to understand that we have to move, when we're talking about places, we have to move away from this idea that somehow U.S. imperialism will oppress us here, but tell us the truth about other countries. That doesn't happen. And I don't know why we have to deal with this contradiction, but we do, right? Why do you think the same country that has mass incarceration, that is investing billions of dollars into wars abroad, with completely ignoring working class people here, why do you think that country is going to tell you the truth about Cuba? Why do you think that country is going to tell you the truth about Nicaragua or Venezuela or any country for that matter, right? You have to do your research. If you want to form an opinion, don't let it be based off of reading one article, and not doing your research on where those sources are coming from. We have to do better than that. And we have to, again, use resources that are well grounded in investigative journalism, because like you can easily combat misinformation with fact, right? It is a fact that hundreds of thousands of Cubans went out in favor of the Cuban Revolution. And it is a fact that very few Cubans went out against, although it was the largest, right, anti-government protests since the revolution, but it wasn't successful. And we had to observe that, right? We're not talking about a few Cubans. We're talking about what is being done for the masses of Cubans, the majority of Cubans that are in favor of the government. And honestly, it is up to Cubans to decide what happens in Cuba. Why are we trying to intervene?
Yeah,
they live there.
That's very well said. The last time that protest that size occurred was in '94 during what's known as El Maleconazo. And I don't know if you recall, but Fidel shows up, no security guards, to the middle of Havana where the protests are taking place. And in 5 minutes, people start chanting, Fidel, 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 which is quite interesting. But we have to remember that there's a country which has 4% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. That country is the U.S., right? We have millions of people in prison working what's basically slave labor for us to then point the finger at Cuba arresting folks that have been funded by their main enemy. That's just completely absurd. How would we act if our main enemy, or at least how we phrase who our enemy is, China, were funding Midwestern Marx and Troika, and then we were leading protests in the streets of Washington, D.C.? Would the U.S. be nice to us and not beat us up? Or what would happen to us? We'd probably disappear from the planet. They probably would take us to Guantanamo and do what they love to do best there. So we have to remember that a lot of the people that were in the streets that were insinuating the protests, which are the ones that have stayed in prison or that stayed for a substantial amount of time, were people that, with beyond reasonable doubt, you could show that they had connections to funding from the U.S. There was a lot of people that were picked up by mistake and released the next day. As soon as they were able to confirm that a family member brought an ID or something, they were able to confirm who they were released. There was an academic, a Trotskyite academic in Cuba who got picked up, and the Western left here that loves to call themselves Marxist but hates all the socialism that has been tried all over the world. They did a letter urging the Cuban government to release this person. They got a bunch of Western academics who call themselves Marxists to sign on to it. And the guy had been out like even after they had done the letter, because he got released the following day in the morning. So most of the people that were picked up were released within a day. Only the people that were proven to have connections to U.S. money were the ones that stayed. And there's a lot. There's, like I said, look up Tracy Eaton Cuba Money Project. He shows all of the sources. They all come from USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, right, which are the two new outfits of the CIA, and they come from the U.S. State Department. More than $1 billion in the last 2 decades has been given to opposition groups in Cuba and in Miami. 300 million of that in the last 10 years has came from taxpayer money. Your money that's taken by the government, used to destabilize Cuba and to promote regime change. Let that sink in for a little bit.
And I think leaning a little bit more into this to move the conversation a little bit more along, let's dive a little bit more into this blockade and kind of the consequences, right? So as a Cuban born in Cuba over here, like what have you been able to observe? Like a lot of people like will listen to the Cubans that are over here and like, oh, the blockade, that doesn't do anything. It's the government. So like, what should our response be to a statement like that?
Well, I think there is a new development within the blockade and a source of profit that has actually been occurring with people outside of Cuba profiting off of the blockade situation in Cuba. With the lack of access to resources like medicine and food and clothing, there has actually been an outside outsourcing business in places, especially like Miami, where people are buying in bulk here, clothing, food, medical resources and sending it to Cuba, not for the sake of actually giving it to the Cuban people, but actually in a pursuit of profit, which has actually been contributing to the rising inflation rates of the current Cuban economy. So they will buy in bulk these products and resources and sell it for 10 times, 20 times the amount, and have the Cuban people pay for that specific resources while they're filling their own pockets and then actually using that money to go back to wherever they're living, especially in Miami specifically. So that is one of the main effects of why the blockade has actually been profitable to some people outside of Cuba. The blockade in general, of course, affects all aspects of the Cuban working situation. Every single aspect, every single aspect, to the air conditioning, to the food that you eat, to the medicine that you take, to the clothing that you wear, every single aspect is affected by the blockade. And it is specifically why the blockade, as you mentioned before, Carlos, the blockade is instilled to disillusion the Cuban masses, into thinking that their conditions is a result of the Cuban government and not of the 63-year genocidal blockade that has been occurring on the island. It's partially the reason behind why there has been discontent with the living standards right now, currently, especially after COVID, especially after the Trump administration increased the sanctions against Cuba. There is this explicit attempt to create more discontent within the Cuban public. Of course, it has been largely unsuccessful because we can, and the Cuban people can dissuade that. The Cuban people can dissuade and be able to see the reality behind the situation. And even though the Cuban worker, the average Cuban worker, has an extremely hard living situation and food situation and food shortage situation, we know for a fact that the roots of our problem continues to be the blockade.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, well said, comrade. I want to give a specific number. In 2020, from April to December, the blockade cost Cuba $9.1 billion. $9.1 billion. That's money that would have been used in resources and in improving the living conditions of Cubans. And we know that because when the Cuban thaw process was going on under Obama, which was mediated by, Pope Francis, quite honestly, when that process was going on in 2014 and 15, Cuba had the highest GDP growth in all of Latin America. And it was a growth that is not a growth that happens in a small upper strata of society. It was a growth that was taking place in all spheres of society, and everyday Cubans were feeling the benefit of the blockade being partially removed for even those 2 to 3 years. But Trump, in order to get the base of the far right in Miami, had to roll back some of the advances that Obama had made. He inputted 243 economic sanctions on Cuba. He banned travel to Cuba, which, knowing how central the tourism sector is for the Cuban economy, you can imagine how bad that hits. He banned remittances, which, as the empire, we are the places where we mess up, where the people come, and those people that come like to send money back to their family members. They banned the remittances, the capacity for people here to send money to their family members in Cuba. He added Cuba to the state sponsor of terrorism list. And then what happens right after? You have a global pandemic, which is conjoined with a global economic crisis. And you have conditions that the U.S. exploits the pandemic in order to have the blockade be more felt, right? So that's one of the difficulties. The blockade is not something static. The blockade moves according to the differences in conditions in each time. So, for instance, when the pandemic hit, one of the ways that the blockade functioned was blocking supplies from getting to Cuba, stuff that Cuba needed in order to deal with the pandemic. Jack Ma, the owner of Alibaba, the Chinese billionaire, he sent a lot of ventilators to Cuba, and those were stopped at a Colombian airport. You have similar instances with other countries sending aid to Cuba. Cuba developed 5 vaccines extremely early on during the pandemic. They were not able to administer them because they didn't have the resources to make the syringes because of the blockade. Okay, so the blockade is dynamic and it affects Cuba in every single way possible. And it's something that we have to absolutely fight against, because I think the reality of the matter is that Lester Mallory was wrong. Economic conditions are going to get tough, but I don't think the people are going to fold. They realize that they prefer autonomy. They prefer the construction of socialism, of a society that centers human beings and the planet and not profit. They prefer that over having, maybe nice things for right in front of them, but having to work 60 hours a week and being in a horrible condition and not having a say over their government, over their economy, over their social institutions, over having things like what we just talked about with the family plan and the 2019 constitutions. They prefer their sovereignty. So it's up to us to fight to lift this blockade, which is murderous and internationally condemned.
Yeah, and again, seeing the effects of the sanctions firsthand, it's really hard to continue to even feed into the idea that sanctions have nothing to do and that it's only the government. It's really wild, right? Because again, lived experience, like one of the benefits, and again, not everybody is going to be able to go to Cuba. This is just a reality. But what we do have to understand is that if we're not going to go, then let's do the research necessary to understand the conditions, right? And so when Cubans here say, when some Cubans, let's not generalize, when some Cubans here, right, say that the sanction has nothing to do with the poverty and everything taking place in Cuba, I laugh. Why? Because we have to understand where these Cubans are, the perspective that they're coming from. A lot of these Cubans left after the revolution and haven't gone back. And the other thing is, a lot of their children are the individuals that are critiquing and saying, we shouldn't lift the blockade, right? It's the government. We have to increase the sanctions on Cuba so that the people can free themselves. And it's like, well, they're pretty free. Why don't you allow them to have access to medical supplies, health, like medical supplies, food, petroleum, do business with whatever government like that they would like to? And the reality is, a lot of people are moving from a place of ignorance. Again, a lot of the people that are asking to maintain the blockade are not people that have ever been to Cuba, are people whose parents left Cuba after the revolution when resources were redistributed to the masses of Cubans, right? And so we do have a reality where you may hear a Cuban saying, oh, I miss the good old days. And what are these good old days that these people are talking about? They're talking about the Batista dictatorship, an actual dictatorship that massacred thousands of Cubans, right? That allowed for slavery to be a legal thing. And so these are the Cubans that are talking about, oh, the good old days, like, oh, we need to go back to that Cuba. And it's a Cuba that didn't see the humanity of all Cubans. It only saw the humanity of those that could afford the privilege of having access to resources. And so after the redistribution of land, the Cuban Revolution, we see a shift in quality of life of Cubans as a whole, right? And we have to understand that. And a lot of people be like, oh, but Fidel Castro's dad is from Spain. That's a fact. But guess what? The first land that he took and redistributed was his dad's farm. So let's understand that there are people that when we're talking about the role of revolutionaries and the things that they do, like we have to move beyond some superficial identity politics bullshit, right? A revolution is for working class people. It's a class thing, right? And so the working class of Cubans have been able to benefit from something. And the reason for the sanctions is the same reason why Haiti got attacked after the Haitian Revolution. We cannot have a successful revolution that pushes back on imperialism or colonization looking like it's not a good option. Imagine if Cuba didn't have sanctions. Not only do they already have the best healthcare system in the world, but imagine if they weren't limited by who they could have relationships with. It would give people an actual example of what a reality that isn't capitalism looks like. And then people would ask for that. That's why there are sanctions on Cuba. And that's why we can't allow the Cuban Revolution to give the appearance of being successful, even though if you go to Cuba, you can see that it has been able to maintain their revolution and, again, be able to afford these human rights to the masses of Cubans.
I also think you can't extrapolate the opinions of the people here and the Cubans that are living here to what the opinions of the Cuban people are in the actual island. There has been sort of an association with the Cuban flag here in the U.S. with racism. Because of the fact that when in Florida there was a criminalization of protests during the Black Lives Matter protests, they criminalized protesting in Florida. But of course, that was not enforced during the July 11th, demonstrations that were given by the Cubans in Miami. And there were several, you can say that there are conclusions to be made that many Cubans in Miami here are simply racist. They have racist roots, and because of the fact that they have familial ties to the Cuban land that had slaves in their own genealogical farms that they owned in Cuba, and nowadays living here in the U.S. and in Miami, having been born out of that family, there is a remnants of racism here of Cubans in Miami, and the Cuban flag has unfortunately been tied to racism, and that is just a contradiction here, at least a contradiction with myself, because when I go to Cuba and I see the Cuban flag, I see that's a flag of liberation of all people. But when you go here,
Miami.
Yeah, exactly. But when you go here and talk to other people who may not be Cuban, they might say, "Oh, that flag might be seen as a
Trump
little
supporter."
Exactly." And that's just, to me, is just extremely insane. And I think is just a testament to the fact that it's just the way that the Cubans here, or not all Cubans, the way that the Cubans here in Miami, or Cubans in the United States, have made Cuba seem like such a horrible place where that has just completely bred out racists and money, and just money hoarders and wealthy people. Is just a complete testament to what Cuba is actually is.
There's a good phrase that comes from the Mexican historian Pago Ignacio Taibo too, who did a big book on Che, and who filmed it as a series on Telesur. And in his time in Cuba, and the episodes that he's doing when Che's in Cuba, he says something that's really the attitude that I think we should have towards some of these sectors of Miami Cubans, which is that, look, I don't have a problem with you being reactionary. You're going to be what you're going to be. My problem is with you fucking lying, right? And that's the real thing that we have to combat. They're going to have their ideas. They have their class interests. They live good. They're the ones driving around in Mercedes down here in South Florida, living in nice houses with their nice pools. But they're going to have their class interests. We can expect that. But what we have to combat is the lies. And they're quite easy to combat, to be honest. If you look at, for instance, like some of the pictures that they were sharing on the July 11th, just Google them. And you can see that they were from 4 or 5 years ago in different places, right? They were talking about, look at the protests in Malecón. It was Egypt. Come on. How Cuban are you that you don't even recognize it, Malecón?
My favorite was when they reposted Diaz-Canel at a protest saying that Cubans were protesting the government. That was my favorite.
Yeah.
I was like, he's sitting right in front. He's sitting right in front. He's in the picture.
Protest against the government.
Yeah.
Oh,
but I kind of, one of our comrades over here had a question that I'm gonna that I'll throw out to us, and then we'll start to wrap up by talking about brigades and ways that folks can experiences of folks. If people wanna, we'll talk about our experiences, and then we'll share about possible experiences that folks who are interested in going to Cuba can participate in. So the question that's being asked is, how can we combat so-called independent critiques and analysis being espoused by self-purported U.S. leftists that uphold an ideological purity fetish on how to construct socialism? And I think, as a philosopher, sir, I think you have something to say about this.
that's my concept. The purity fetish. I've written articles on that. I'm kind of wondering now who asked it, but how do you battle it? Well, by showing what truth is on our side, guys. Che said it well. It's not my fault. Reality's Marxist, but that's what it is. Truth is on our side, and we what the dialectical materialists, which us Marxists and Marxist-Leninists adhere to as a method. What the dialectical materialist method tells us to do is analyze each situation concretely. And effectively, this means that we have to look at everything in its history and its interconnection and its movements, and we have to look at as many factors as possible. One of the things that leads people to making these mistakes is that they analyze facts separated from the factors that allowed the fact to be a fact, right? And that is effectively like coming into a boxing match and trying to judge the fight if you only saw the 12th round. That is a big mistake, right? We would say that, hey, that judge is probably not going to do a very good job, but that's what these people do, right? They just judge, oh, there's people in the street protesting against the government. Oh, there's these things lacking in Cuba. Oh, there's bread lines. And if they just look at the fact and they disconnect it from the factors, not only are they not going to understand, the history of the fact, they're not going to understand the fact itself, right? And part of what our method as Marxists urges us to do is do this concrete investigation that analyzes everything behind the fact in its interconnections, in its movement. And this is how you fight against these pseudo-leftists. I consider them to be grounded in anti-dialectical thinking. And that's why they make a lot of their mistakes in their political analysis, geopolitical analysis, and their political analysis here at home, because I think that purity fetish reflects itself at home in them saying, look, we can't organize this sector of workers because they don't have so-and-so belief, right? And that's ultimately detrimental to the working class movement and to the task that we have here in the U.S. in the belly of the beast, which is a very special task of overthrowing the empire. Once the empire is overthrown, other countries can have their socialist revolutions and revolutionary movements flourish peacefully, right? So it's so central that we carry on this fight, and the conditions really couldn't be any riper. So how do you fight against these people? Expose them for what they are. They're lapdogs of imperialism. They're right opportunists. And that's what, the Marxist-Leninist tradition has really always done. Expose the people who claim to be in the side of the working class, but who are actually the lackeys of imperialism and the capitalist class.
Yeah, and I think just adding on to that, right? That's liberalism. Let's be honest, right? It's again like it's taking out, like, just looking at one thing and pretending like that is the reality outside of all the contradictions. And so when people talk about, oh yeah, I support the left, but I don't know about Cuba, or I don't know about Nicaragua, or I don't know about Venezuela, it's taking away all the contradictions that imperialism is creating to attack these countries, right? If we talk about Venezuela and we're critiquing about, how Venezuelans had to leave, and completely take out of context the fact that there was sanctions that were imposed, and in fact, right, although we're not talking about Venezuela, just to give people a concrete example, the first year that sanctions were imposed on Venezuela, 40,000 Venezuelans died because the government of Venezuela was supporting the masses of Venezuelans using the money from petroleum, which obviously that needs to be critiqued, because no one government should be completely reliant on one thing. But again, we're going to talk about the facts, right? That is something that they had to resolve. That is true. But the reality is, because of U.S. sanctions, 40,000 Venezuelans died. That was not the Venezuelan government. That was U.S. imposed sanctions that, as we are saying, are inhumane and kill people. And this is a real thing, right? The fact that Cuba, they created their own 5 vaccines, 4 of which have been approved, right? The fact that they weren't able to distribute those, that's a problem, right? Because that's not killing anybody. That's helping to resolve a global pandemic. And in fact, Cubans were also the first doctors to send people to some of the most to some of the worst places, like Italy, when people were dying in mass. This is the militant task of doctors in a country that understands that healthcare is a right, that it doesn't matter whether or not you can afford it, because it shouldn't be about whether you can afford it. It's about whether or not you're human, and every human has the human right to have access to these things. And that is something that the Cuban government has always upheld, right? Not only did Cuba send soldiers to Africa when they were helping liberate the country, they sent doctors and they sent teachers so that they can educate and so that they can make sure that the masses were healthy. Right? This is not something that a dictatorship does. I've never met a dictator that runs a literacy campaign to make sure that over 90% of the population can read. A dictator doesn't want you to have knowledge, but guess what? In Cuba, that's the reality. Over 99% of people can read.
The literacy rate is very, very much higher than the one in the U.S. I think there's the last statistics that I've seen is like 40-something% of Americans read at a level that's below like 5th grade. It just doesn't exist in Cuba. But what's funny about the Henry Reeve Brigade, which is actually named after a soldier, an American soldier that participated in the Cuban War of Independence. What's interesting about the Henry Reeve Brigade is that, you know, these people that turn everything upside down in the West, these imperialist lackeys, they tried to pass what they were doing as forced labor, right? These heroes of the revolution going to the places in the world that are the most in need of the help of a country that has per capita more doctors than anywhere else in the world. These heroes are then made into victims of Cuban forced labor. Like, it's so absurd. And the arguments have been getting worse and worse. One of the interesting things that I don't think we've mentioned is that after the July 11th protests, the U.S. tried to call a meeting of the OAS, and the OAS has never been really a friend of Cuba. There was an old song by, the name is Carlos Puebla, which it used to go like this: how am I not going to laugh at the OAS if it's something so ugly? And then he goes, ha, 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 ha. And it's a really funny song. I might sing it to you guys afterwards. But, the OAS nonetheless decided, no, we don't really have anything to meet with. And the OAS meeting that the U.S. called on the Cuban situation from July 11 had to be canceled. So even the people that are the allies of imperialism have gotten to a point where they're like, okay, you know, like the stuff that you're fabricating has a lot of holes, and most people are able to see through it quite clearly. Like this calling doctors forced laborers. One of the first people to kick out the Cuban doctors was Bolsonaro. And I don't have an ounce of sympathy for that guy in my body, but right after, he had to beg for them to come back. So, yeah.
Thank you for saying that, and remind me to take you on the next karaoke event that we do. We'll start to wrap things up. So, Conrad, you have been to Cuba and through a brigade. Can you explain your experiences, not only yourself being able to participate in a brigade and go back to your beautiful country, but also seeing other people's reactions to going to Cuba?
Right. I mean, I think I was the only Cuban there in the brigade. There were many. I mean, it was just the brigade specifically was from the U.S. and most of the people there were from other countries. I think I was the only Cuban there, actually. But I was able to see a lot of things that I hadn't seen before. I was taken to meetings with like local union organizations. I met with the FMC, the Federation for Cuban Women. I also met with CDR, which was the national coordinator of CDR was Gerardo Machado, which was one of the Cuban 5 members. We had several meetings and we talked about, you know, the CDR is currently planning neighborhood sanitation projects and neighborhood construction projects. And they educated us on the fact that the CDR has several steps and several meetings that they have to go through where they receive local complaints. CDR membership is placed in each neighborhood, and there's a CDR leader in each neighborhood, and that CDR leader receives complaints or worries or concerns by each member of the neighborhood. And that's basically how the system of Cuba works, where it's at a local level, then it turns into a national level, and all of that is meticulously strategized and worked through many members. And it is a commitment. It's a collective effort at, you know, sustaining the revolution, sustaining the people, sustaining the health of the people. And also, we also got to visit agricultural sites because the agroecological sector of Cuba is very interesting. It's a very interesting subject. I got to meet with farmers and gardeners, and they talked about their different indigenous techniques where they instead of having like linear landscape areas of gardening, they actually had curvatures where it was actually an indigenous technique to be able to reserve more water. And they also had scientific improvements in plants such as yucca, where they were able to plant yucca in less than 3 months rather than the typical wait time of 10 to 12 months, which is a great advancement for the Cuban people to be able to have that food resource in such a little amount of time. But unfortunately, we also had to meet, the darker side of Cuba, where they would talk to us about their improvements, but also the fact that they cannot improve. They can only improve so much because of the blockade. They talked to us about the fact that they cannot have access to certain things like solar panels and necessary tools that they need in places like gardening and in the farming places. Yeah, it was an amazing experience. I would love to go on a brigade like that again. And being able to connect with people, and the fact that I saw people from different countries, from like Chile and Brazil, and telling me and discussing with me about the fact that they are so miserable in their country and they wish to live in a country so revolutionary as Cuba, who actually defends the poor person's right, the working class's rights, the rights of the people, and not the rights of the few elite.
And what brigade was this?
It was the May Day Brigade.
How many people were out in the streets? Because in Miami, it was nice, but I'm sure Cuba was a little better.
No, yeah, I think there was a turnout of like 260 people in total from various countries around the world, like Turkey, Sweden, Chile, Brazil. Many people in support of the Cuban Revolution. We actually had more of a smaller turnout because of COVID, but still in the end, there was a lot of people there to be able to experience and be hands-on with the Cuban experience and what the Cuban goes through day to day.
260,000, right?
Oh, the May Day Parade. Okay,
Yeah.
so the brigade is called May Day Brigade, but the actual May Day, there was about 650,000, I think was the statistic that I read.
Telesur showed the videos. They were insane.
Yeah, it was awesome. I got especially impressed with the medical workers that they had, because like the lines would show like the specific work sector that they worked in. And when I think it was the biotech sector, it was a lot of people, many chants. People are so proud of the work that they do and proud of the fact that they're supported by their governments and supported by the fact that they have been able to achieve so much, even though their resources are so little, which is an impressive thing that Cuba has. They're so malleable with the little things that they have. They can fit what their needs to the little conditions that they have.
Absolutely, it's so condescending when these narratives, like the one of the doctor, is spun in order to victimize Cubans that feel themselves and genuinely are the protagonist in the construction of everyday life in Cuba, because they see like that their individual interests are so tied to the collective. It's kind of beautiful. But we have to remember that there was a time in '91 when the narrative around the world was that this capitalist imperialist system is the end of the world. This is the end of history, right? And Fukuyama's, as he mentioned in this article, and Cuba was the last hope not just Latin America but the world had, right? And that's something that the Cuban people remember, that they've been the beacon for an alternative way of structuring the human social interactions, and specifically human social interactions with nature. We have right now a fight against the clock with climate change, and Cuba has been rated consistently the most sustainable developed country on Earth, right? And these sustainability practices come from the ingenuity of the Cuban people during the time like at Periodo Especial and other times where resources were scarce and they had to, like they say in Cuba, tenían que inventar, and they had to figure out a way somehow to get things done. And a lot of the ways that they figured out to get some of the basic things done were very sustainable practices that now more developed countries are looking into. So Cuba is a beacon of hope, and I think that if you lift the blockade, you're going to see a growth in wealth in Cuba that's going to be distributed, that's going to create conditions so that everyone has the basic things that they need in order to flourish in life, which is they have it now, but whenever they don't have it, it's a result of the blockade. So it's really going to be a shining example for the working class that's 90 miles north of Cuba, which is oppressed and which lives in horrible conditions, because the enemy is the same one that keeps Cuba under a blockade. So we have to remember that our struggle is also tied to their struggle against imperialism, because the agents keeping us both oppressed are the same.
Yeah, and just to also reflect, I went with Witness for Peace, Solidarity Collective to Cuba, and I mean, even for me, it's so interesting, right? Because you talk about a place like Cuba, and in any like leftist, like for me as a Marxist Leninist, in my mind, it's like it is the place, right? It is the shining example. It is the beacon of everything that we need to be moving towards. And I can be honest in saying, I definitely hyper romanticize Cuba, because I think when we think about revolution, we like oftentimes we do the shit like a la carte, right? Like you hear the good things and you have to use these things to combat the lies that are being told, right? Because it's not like I'm lying about the reality of Cuba. But I would say, as someone that like went to go visit, seeing the reality of Cubans, it's not easy to be Cuban in Cuba. It is not. But millions of Cubans had decided to take on the militant and revolutionary task of continuing to uphold the difficulty of enforcing this revolution that they fought so hard for, despite being attacked by imperialism. And I think that has given me a lot more respect to see, like to actually see how ellos se inventan la cosa, right? How they're able to maintain things despite having so little. And and when I tell you, like a Cuban will drop everything they're doing to help you out. Like it doesn't matter what they're doing. If they see that you're distressed or you're in trouble, they don't care if you're Cuban or they don't care if you're from somewhere else. They actually, and all the Cubans will say this, we're not against the working class people of the US. We're against the government. And guess what? So am I, right? Because that's the primary contradiction, imperialism. That's what we're all fighting against. But when I went to Cuba and when I saw the reality, it's like, fuck, these people are fighting for this. Like literally, despite the consequences. Like I said, there's a consequence for everything. The Cuban people are taking a consequence for being a beacon and an example of saying fuck you to imperialism and creating a world where people are treated like humans, and ensuring that everybody has access to human rights, and ensuring that other countries can continue to fight for freedom and that other countries get these human rights, because that's what Cubans do. They don't only, it's not just about Cuba, it's about everywhere else. It's about making sure that everybody gets free. And Cuba has been able to do that despite the sanctions. And yeah, there are like lines to get, your rations. That's just the reality. But that is not a reality that's created by the Cuban government. That's a reality that happens because of the US sanctions that are not allowing goods to go into Cuba. And I think we have to be very specific about that. And to understand that if the sanctions, when the sanctions are lifted, right, that we will see a very different side. And we will see even more that not only is socialism not a failed project. In fact, it is the thing that we should be looking to do here on Turtle Island and in other places. And being in Cuba is like, for me, it's like going into the future that has a facade of the past. Like when you go to Cuba, you're gonna see like that old facade, like the Spanish architecture, the cobble streets and whatnot. But I say it's like going to the future with a past facade, because you're gonna feel like you're in the future, because everything that we're fighting for here in Turtle Island is already a thing over there. So it's like, oh my God, I literally, when I came back, imperialism like kind of just like pushed down on me. It took me about 2 days to realize why I was not feeling good and like why I was feeling heavy. And it's because when I went to Cuba, I felt light. I wasn't scared for my life. When I saw a cop, I wasn't scared. Those police were founded after the revolution. That makes a difference, right? When you have
everything that was founded after the revolution, when you systematically change the way that you do things, the country feels different. I could breathe there. And I think that that's something I want people to take away. If you all are interested, there's Venceremos Brigade. There is Witness for Peace, Solidarity Collective that does brigades as well.
NNOC also does brigades. The NNOC had done the Mayday Brigade this year, and also U.S. Hands Off Cuba as well.
And Pastors for Peace, who we have teamed up with, donate so we can send medical supplies to Cuba and continue to support the Cuban people that are continuing to support people all over the world. It's our internationalist task to support Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, all revolutions and all working class movements to liberate themselves from imperialism. So we'll make space for closing words. So Comrade Carlos.
I usually give the same spiel at the end of every podcast, but I think it's good to repeat it. It's something that Bernie, although we have our disagreements with Bernie, but he repeats the discourse and it gets stuck on people's minds. But folks, we're at a time where 80% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. 60,000 people in the U.S. are dying because they don't have insurance or are underinsured. Let me say it again, right? It's not the case that they don't have, the insulin or the things that they need in order to survive. It's that they don't have insurance, which is absurd. It's only in the U.S. where a condition like that exists. Half of Americans, they're a lost paycheck away from homelessness, which is something that I've repeated a couple of times here. But it's important to remember we're dealing with homelessness. We're dealing with inflation, which keeps going up while wages stay at the same place. I used to fill my tank with $22 and now it's 61. Most Americans are feeling the burden of that, and they're trying to scapegoat the blame on Russia and on the proxy war the U.S. is carrying out in Eastern Europe. But the reality is that the blame is in the system, right? The blame is in the system because countries in the global south have put caps at how high you can put gas and some of the basic commodities so that the inflation crisis hasn't hit those countries, and so that their people's living standard stays relatively the same while there's a global crisis going on. So we have to remember that, the conditions are ripe here for revolution. Like, people are dissenting to the existing order. Some of them are coming up with, these crazier conspiracies, but that's really a result of us not going to them and showing that the distress that they feel on an everyday basis is tied to the existing order, and that it's the same order that keeps Cuba in the horrible conditions under this illegal, internationally condemned blockade, and that does the same thing to Venezuela, to Nicaragua, to Iran, to the DPRK, to various countries that around the world that exist outside of the sphere of influence of U.S. and NATO imperialism. So now's the time to unite, not to bicker over small arguments on Twitter. Now's the time to come together and to fight for an anti-imperialist platform that centers the working class and poor people here at home, so that they can grab power of the existing institutions, grab power of the state, and abolish this imperialist order, which sends our brothers and sisters here to wars abroad, where they come back either dead or with missing limbs or with mental problems, and it's very sad. And this is all historical reality. It's not eternal. It hasn't always been like this, and if it was put this way by a specific group of people at a specific point in time, that means that we can change it. It's not something that's God made or something, right? We can change it. We can change it if we organize in a revolutionary manner and fight to change it. Capitalism creates the conditions for a higher form of society that prioritizes people and planet over profit, but it creates the conditions. It doesn't automatically, inevitably make people rebel. That's up to us, the folks who have revolutionary consciousness, to get the masses on board a revolutionary platform. And it's life or death, especially for folks in our generation with climate change on the scene. So that'll be my closer remark. And the struggle that we have is, of course, tied to the Cuban struggle against imperialism and the blockade.
So I want to touch on the fact that, I left Cuba also at a young age. I did have problems with access to medication as a child. So that's partially one of the reasons why I left. My mom and I did not leave Cuba because of political reasons. And most Cubans that leave Cuba do not leave Cuba because of political reasons. Most of the Cubans that leave Cuba is because of economic problems that are a result of the blockade. So Cuban migration out of Cuba is a direct result of the Cuban blockade. That is just a fact, and that's something that needs to be analyzed. And the fact that Cubans, when they arrive to the U.S., they do not have these anti-Cuban political sentiments, and they do not foster them until they are propagandized by this country. That's something that can be example, and there's many, many examples to this. And I think it's important to analyze this and important to highlight this fact. Another thing is that the Cuban Revolution and the things that we talked about today with women's liberation and, the empowerment of social, economic, physical, all of those sorts of things that empower women in Cuba is not a result of just Cuba being this magical heaven that just magically decided to do this for women. It's supposed to be analyzed in a historical construct, in the fact that Cuba could not have achieved this if it were not under the guise of a socialist project. And that is just a fact. This aim for women's liberation, Black liberation, working class liberation cannot be achieved under the constructs of capitalism. But yeah, these are final statements.
Thank you. My final thoughts are, what are things folks can do? Again, we are working with Pastors for Peace to send medical supplies to the people of Cuba. Also, we have a task to lift the illegal blockade and over 600 sanctions that are placed on the people of Cuba, and to lean into investigative journalism when we talk about places like Cuba, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, because we can very easily just become unconscious consumers of knowledge and then believe lies. But what we want is change, and it's not going to be comfortable, right? It's not going to be comfortable to go to a Cuban and be like, nah, you're wrong, homie. Like, these are the facts about like the experiences of Cubans, right? Which is why we're so thankful for sources like Belly of the Beast that does that task of investigative journalism to give a better picture of the reality of Cuba, and all the things that encapsulates. And I think it's important to note, thousands of Cubans that are in the U.S. do not outnumber millions of Cubans that are in Cuba, that are asking for the lifting of the blockade, that are not asking for U.S. intervention. And so think about that. Like, yes, we all have our lived experiences. We have people that have their own experiences, but we're talking about masses of people versus a few. And so please, if you can donate for the medical supplies, you can just go to Troika. We have the fire up, but also go watch War on Cuba. We'll be having an event in August with the Belly of the Beast and some other groups here in Miami. And the last thing that I would say that I would like to leave you all with is the revolution that was fought in Cuba, like the revolution in Nicaragua, like the revolution in Venezuela. The aim was peace and love, and solidarity. And so when you fight that war and when you win that revolution, you'll see that Cuba is not starting wars with other countries, right? And that is a beautiful thing. And so we have to support what the masses of Cubans have fought for. We have to be in actual, like, tangible solidarity, which means that we are fighting against the U.S. blockade. And if you have the opportunity, go on a brigade to Cuba. It's a beautiful place. Regardless of what some people might say, you're not going to be locked up. for having an opinion or for being ignorant, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So let's be in solidarity with the people of Cuba. Let's end the blockade. And thank everybody for participating and being in this space. And this is something that we will continue to do to dispel these imperialist lies about this beautiful country called Cuba. Oh, there's people here, by the way.
All right, brother. Thank you. See ya. Take care.
Take care.
Well, all right, folks. Thank you all who watched, and we'll have this stream. We'll chop it up so that the part of the discussion alone makes its own video on YouTube. But thanks again for all those who watched, and see ya.